So that was a very basic class. Now, when building classes, they often get more complex than that, and you might want to store more data in there. Let's say a department also should have employees. That could be an array, and initially it might be an empty array. And to also be a bit more precise about what we want to store in there, it could be a string array to keep it relatively simple. Now we could have a method here, add employee. There we want an employee as an argument, which should just be a string in our example. And then we can set this employees push, so push a new employee onto our employees array with this code. Now we could also add another method, print employee information. And there I want to console log this.employees.length. And I also want to console log this.employees itself. Now if we go down here, now we can comment out this code here, which would break again, because we, again, don't fit the department description with our object down there. And instead here, on this accounting department, we can add an employee, let's say Max, and another employee, let's say Manu. And then besides describing it, I also want to get my employee information down there. If we save this, we should get this output, 2 employees, and here is some information. Now that's all nice to have. One problem we have with this class is that we could change employees from outside, not only with add employee, but by directly accessing the employee's property, just as we can do it for the name as well, by the way. So what I mean is we could also go to accounting and then reach out to employees and maybe add another employee at index 2 and there pass in Anna like that. If we do that and we save it, we get 3 employees and we get Anna. Now you might think, well, great, we got another way. Well, when building more complex applications, you typically want to avoid something like this though. You want to make sure that there is one clear path, one way of using your class, and that things like that, alternative ways of using it, are not really supported. Because if you're working in a bigger team, well, then one colleague is going to use this approach for adding an employee, another colleague might use this approach. And you don't want this. You want to have one uniform way of doing this. Also, because maybe in the add employee method, you do more than just add it to the array. Maybe you first of all want to have some validation, etc. in here. So you might have extra code in there which simply does not execute if you directly assign a new value or add a new value to the array with this line here. So you don't want to permit that employees is accessible like this from outside of the class. And TypeScript has got you covered. You can turn employees here into a private property, a private field, by adding the private keyword in front of it. Now what private means is that employees is now a property which is only accessible from inside the class, so from inside the created object. So any method inside of the department class is able to still work with employees. But you can't access it like this anymore. Here you see I'm now getting an error. If I try to save this, I get a compilation error that the property employees is private and only accessible within the class department. So now we force that when employees should be added to this department, people have to use the add employee method because they get an error if they write code like this. This is a so-called modifier here, the private keyword. And besides private, we also got public, which is the default though. You don't need to add public. So name like this is exactly the same as name with public in front of it. The difference is that public properties are accessible from outside. So for example here, I could also reach out to name and assign a new name here if I wanted to. That is possible. For private properties, this here is not possible. We can only use them from inside. Technically, by the way, JavaScript doesn't know public and private. Only in very modern versions, added recently, such a thing exists, In the past, JavaScript didn't know private or public properties. All properties always were public there. TypeScript introduces this feature, which of course does not work during runtime, however, because JavaScript, until recently, only knew public properties. So this line here throws an error during TypeScript compilation. If we compile it to JavaScript, nonetheless, this code would still execute at runtime without errors, because again, JavaScript on its own, until recently, didn't know this concept, so depending on the version you're compiling for, it still won't know it, and therefore TypeScript only supports this because it checks it during compilation, not at runtime. With it, however, we can avoid code like this and force everyone to write cleaner code.